in cash prizes each year to first, second, and third place professional category winners and an individual or team in the student category. This year, the Cronkite School received entries from across the nation with submissions from publications and newsrooms such as the Los Angeles Times, NPR, Mother Jones, Native News Online, Esquire, the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the Arizona Republic. Schools represented amongst this year's student entries include Arizona State University, Syracuse, the University of Maryland, NYU, Columbia, and more. Professional category entries are reviewed and judged by a panel of reporters and editors from across the country. Submissions in the student category are reviewed and judged by faculty at the Cronkite School and other journalism programs across the country. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge this year's panel of judges. In the professional category, Kathy Best, Director of the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at the University of Maryland Philip Merrill College of Journalism and former executive editor of the Seattle Times. Janine Jones, Design Editor at the Center for Public Integrity, and Asra Mustafa, Managing Editor of The Examination. In the student category, Cronkite graduate and 2022 Shaufler Prize in Journalism first place winner, Ida Lee Campa, an independent journalist formerly with Inside Climate News. Cronkite graduate Adrian Flynn, former director of the University of Maryland Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. And Catherine Williams, RWJF Professor of Practice here at the Cronkite School. Thank you to this year's esteemed judges. Before we present this year's awards, I would like to invite Paul to the podium to share what inspired his vision for the Shaufler Prize in Journalism. Please join me in welcoming Paul Anderson.
Thank you, Dean Batts. I want to recognize my daughter Aspen, who's out here today, who's a journalism major, and I'm thrilled to have her here today. So Ed and I were friends for 30 years. Ed and I loved to sit around the kitchen table on Sundays when we were together visiting and talk about stories and what stories meant to us. And we just loved and reveled reading and talking about stories that were relatable. And there's one thing in common that all of those stories had, which is it related how things that were happening in the world impacted people and individuals. We can remember those stories. I think we can all remember stories that were told to us. I think our human brains are designed to remember stories about other people, more so than statistics and facts, which are great and important. But how do those things actually impact people? So I know I only have a few minutes, so I'm gonna actually do something different this year that I've done in others. I'm gonna give you a musing that I thought about on the plane coming over here. For those of us who've traveled around the world, sometimes we go to places far and wide, and we're in unfamiliar places, and we hear, oh, there's a familiar accent, and we find someone who we know just based on what they say, whether they have my accent, but with the way they conduct themselves, we know that they come from our part of the world. And there's a comfort in that, knowing that you meet people around the world, even though we like run away to escape our own communities to enjoy the world, there's a comfort in finding people who have a familiar experience. It's interesting to me that we live in a society now where all of our differences are so pronounced and exacerbated and magnified across various media in a way that distorts our common experience as human beings. And it seems to me that journalism, ethical storytelling, battle-tested against not only the ethics, but the standards and practices that you learn at schools like the Cronkite School, help weave stories together of our common humanity that make all of us familiar to each other, even if it's an experience that we haven't personally experienced. Journalism is the most important form of storytelling that will weave together to allow us continue our great experiment that is called democracy. But that means that we have to tell these stories ethically and objectively so that we can all hear those stories. When you go to a far-off land and you hear this familiar voice, you don't care that that voice you've heard is from Kentucky, from Minnesota, from Miami, from Seattle, where we live, a fun Southern accent that we like to make fun of here in the West. We don't care where they're from. We don't care if they're Republicans or Democrats. We don't care if we just care like, oh, this is familiar. I think we all make ourselves more familiar to each other as human beings and our experience by telling great stories that we all can listen and relate to. And I think that common humanity that can be learned through great storytelling is what hopefully keeps us together. It's the glue that is our society. So I want to congratulate the recipients this year. I know that the first prize person from the New York Times could not be here today because she's got a baby coming or a baby on the way, so congratulations. But I want to thank you for dedicating your professional lives to journalism because we know you're not in it for the money. But being able to tell others' stories is a responsibility and it's a gift and allows you to deploy your own creativity, your own ability to listen and then test objectively whether you're telling the story in a way that provides all the angles that your editors insist on having so that it's not skewed. That professional journalism is the essence of our democracy. Without the essence of our democracy, truth in storytelling, there is no democracy. So I want to thank Dean Batts, the Cronkite School, unbelievable institution here that is dedicated to objective storytelling. To all the recipients, congratulations again. And as you all travel the world, remember that when you hear those voices, go, wait a second here, that feels good to meet someone who is familiar. Because it's our humanity and our commonality as Americans. Whether you speak with my accent or an accent that you've brought to this country from somewhere else, we come here and become Americans, and our common experience is what keeps us together. But that doesn't work. That doesn't work unless we listen. And journalism hopefully allows us to listen better to each other and relate. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And now, we are excited to present this year's winners with their awards. Paul, I want to invite you to come back up to the stage. When I announce your name, come and accept your award, and please remain on stage. All right, so the Shaufler Prize winner in the student category goes to New York City News Service team at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York for their story, Hard Lessons, an examination of the new long-term challenges raised by COVID and other challenges in New York schools. Joining us this evening from City University of New York are Sophia Riddle, Anna Rodriguez Martinez, and Isha Ray. And now for our professional prize winners. In third place, lead reporters Ramel Ojeda and John Upton for Surviving the Water, New York City's flooding crisis in the age of climate change, produced by Documented, Climate Central, and the Pulitzer Center. This investigation delved into the floods that have threatened the neighborhood of Hollis, Queens for more than a century. John Upton is not able to be with us this evening, but joining us via Zoom, we want to congratulate John and Ramel. In second place, Courtney Tanner of the Salt Lake Tribune for her project, Failing the Utes, which explored how children from the Ute tribe perform poorly in school as measured by dropout rates, graduation rates, and testing proficiency. The children are from the tribe that gave Utah its name. And the first place winner of this year's Shaufler Prize in Journalism is Hannah Dreyer of the New York Times for Alone and Exploited, a powerful and comprehensive examination of the resurgence of child labor in the United States. Hannah, as Paul indicated, is not able to be with us this evening, but recorded a special message accepting this award. Let's hear from Hannah.
Thank you so much to the Cronkite School for this tremendous honor. And I'm so sorry that I can't be there with you all at this event in person. I wanted to talk a little bit about this project. I began it about 2 years ago with a question. I wanted to know what was happening to the hundreds of thousands of children who were crossing the border without their parents and starting new lives in this country. What I found was an unprecedented child labor crisis in America. There are nearly 400,000 children now who've crossed the border by themselves just in the past 3 years. And what I found is that a majority of them are ending up working full-time. They're working on household products like Cheerios, Oreos, Fruit of the Loom socks, J.Crew shirts, and they're often getting injured. Sometimes they're dying. They're falling from 50-foot buildings where they've been hired to be roofers. They're getting their arms mangled in assembly lines at slaughterhouses. And all of this is happening in complete violation of child labor laws. I'd like to accept this huge honor in recognition of the children who took tremendous risks to tell their stories. These were kids who really had nothing to gain from sharing their experiences other than the hope of helping other kids like them. And in the end, their bravery created real change across federal agencies and at some of the world's biggest corporations. It's so wonderful to see this work honored like this. I just can't thank you enough.
Beautiful. And now let's pose for a group photo with all the winners here on stage. Once again, congratulations to all of our Shaufler Prize in Journalism winners and these outstanding journalists. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator of our panel discussion. Angela Hill is the Ida B. Wells Professor in Journalism here at the Cronkite School. Prior to joining the Cronkite School, Angela served as the senior video producer at the Washington Post, where along with her team, she produced investigative stories such as Built and Broken, where she helped produce a 12-minute mini documentary focusing on the exploitation of female athletes within the sport of bodybuilding, and a mini documentary looking at mental health emergencies calls that led to fatal police shootings. Angela is a multi-award winning journalist and producer who joined the Cronkite School earlier this year and is the first person to serve full-time as the Ida B. Wells Professor in Journalism, a position created in honor of Wells, an African-American investigative journalist, educator, and early leader in the civil rights movement. We are excited to have Angela lead an engaging conversation with our prize winners this evening. Angela?
Good evening, everyone. I am extremely honored and thrilled to be moderating this discussion this evening. We have such a wonderful opportunity to hear more about these incredibly important, well-reported, and compelling stories from our journalists. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. To my left, we have Courtney Tanner of the Salt Lake Tribune, who reported the story Failing the Utes. Next to her, we have Ramel Ojeda, who joins us from Climate Central. He reported with his colleague John Upton. They reported surviving the water, New York City's flooding crisis in the age of climate change. Also wanted to recognize from my alma mater, the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York and the New York City News Service. We have joining us Safia Riddle, former student, Anna Rodriguez Martinez, also a former student, and Aisha Ray is a faculty member at the university. We are so excited to have you all here with us this evening and look forward to having such a hearty conversation and discussion about some of the stories you reported on. So let's jump right in. I'd like to start somewhat broad. We'll have an opportunity to kind of delve into some of the finer points of your reporting and your stories, but I would like for each of you to take just a couple of minutes to talk to me about how you came to report this story, how you found your story, or maybe the story found you, and why you felt it was so imperative to tell this particular story. So Courtney, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Okay, is this, oh, there we go. Yeah, so I reported on the education of Ute students and how they're left behind in the public school system in Utah. And it started because there was this pretty intense nationwide focus and also in Canada on Indigenous boarding schools and the lives lost at those, unfortunately. And so we at the Tribune had started with a project that looked at those schools. There were 8 of them in Utah. And this was kind of spurred by that. We wanted to see, what happened next. Did that legacy of mistreatment in the boarding schools carry into the public schools? And as we started to look at the data, it showed that it did.
I remember reading your story, and I just started thinking to myself, in so many certain circumstances, it's sort of like the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So I was reminded of so much great reporting that's been done on the Indian boarding schools, some reporting I've done myself at the Washington Post. I'm looking at this issue from around 1869 into the 1960s, and in some places into the 1970s, and just thinking about all these children that were abused and neglected, whose cultures and identities were stripped. And then here we are decades later, and we're seeing students in Utah, certain parts of the state, and I suspect across the country, who are experiencing similar things, right? The neglect in a different form, in some ways in similar forms. And so thank you so much for reporting that story. It's a very important one. Ramel, I want to turn to you now and have you talk a little bit about sort of how you and your colleagues found this story, how it came to you, and why you felt it was so important to tell the story.
Yes, so in 2021, we had Hurricane Ida devastate most of the East Coast. And in New York City, it led to the death of 11 migrants who lived in basement apartments. And a lot of the newsrooms, they were covering what had happened and covering the stories over and over again. But what we wanted to find out is why it had happened, what was the systemic structures that permitted this to happen. So what we did is we started tracking the 311 data to see which blocks were being afflicted the most during rainfalls. And because it has been going on in certain districts, we ended up in this block that had been flooding for the past 100 years. And the city did not know they had these photos. We told them, like, hey, we have evidence that you have actually, paid people to take photos of the floods because you want to keep records of them. But they kept denying it. So then we decided to look into the architecture of the houses and see how they had been affected throughout the years. And the whole idea is to say, hey, this has been happening for a while. These neighborhoods have been flooding, and other neighborhoods who happen to be predominantly immigrant-owned, they will be flooding in the future as well. And we dug into the data to also sort of prove that.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, as someone who used to live in New York City area and was there for so long, I was there when Hurricane Sandy happened. It was such a tragic, climate change situation. And so to see this continue year after year and seemingly little done about it, your reporting was so eye-opening and so important. So thank you so much for helping to share that story. CUNY team, I'll turn to you now. Why don't you share with us a little bit about how you came to your stories. You had a series of stories in your package and sort of why you felt it was so imperative to tell that. And Safia or Aisha or Anna, whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll go.
Okay.
So I co-taught the class with another professor, Jessica Machado, in the fall of 2021. And so this project came out of that class. And Anna was one of our students who was a managing editor of the project, and Safia was one of our reporters. And so the whole sort of theme of the piece was, education 3 years into COVID. We were in fall 2021, a new school year starting, and if I remember correctly, it's all starting to blur together, which I'm sure it is for a lot of us the last couple of years. But we were kind of coming back to in-person learning. Things were starting to get back to normal. And I think we sort of had this discussion in our class about, yes, students are coming back, but what has happened over the last couple years, and what has sort of been left behind in all of this. And what we ended up finding out was the disparities that had existed long before COVID continue to exist. But in a lot of ways exacerbated because of the issues of COVID and remote learning and just access to things. And we cast our net wide because the issues obviously don't just exist within the City Department of Education, but across a variety of different types of education systems. So we looked into the education system in Rikers as well. Obviously, fraught with issues, and with education even more so. And we thought big. I think we sort of went into it thinking this is going to be a big endeavor, but the passion and the hard work and just the determination to report out these stories, to see the final project that it actually came together, I'm just so proud of everyone. It really delivered.
Oh, and just to add, it also came, I guess, from our experience as students ourselves, especially my year, the class of 2022. I think our first 2 semesters were sort of hybrid or remote for some classes, and we felt that the education system in ourselves was being affected in the way that we were learning and the way that we were adapting, especially in New York City. So I think it was just a team effort of just, well, if we're feeling this way, how do kids in the public school system, how do kids in Rikers, and people across the city, not just in a formal education setting, how has things changed? Because we felt it change in ourselves as well.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just add that my piece was also pretty personal. I was writing about desegregation efforts within a single district in New York City in Lower Manhattan that has been extremely segregated for decades. But I tried to tell that story, in light of all the money that had been poured somewhat unsuccessfully into the district to try and integrate it. I told that through one school building that had 2 schools in it, 2 elementary schools, both public, but that had drastically different racial and socioeconomic compositions. And I say it's personal because I grew up in that neighborhood. I grew up in the public schools in that district, and it wasn't until I became a reporter and went to CUNY that I realized that there was actually a really big story that kind of could look into a really central part of my upbringing. And so I was really grateful for the opportunity to kind of explore that in a more formal way.
Yeah, and I was really moved by these stories and your particular story when you talked with, parents Leslie and Ramona, and just being able to see some of the things that they were trying to process to try to determine which school they would send their children to, right? And their different perspectives and the different experiences that each child was having, really within the same building but on different sides, right? So I really appreciate you teasing that out. And I think, looking at the entirety of your series, you just really were able to explore so many different nuances within the New York public education system to take us from looking at arts education and how that was being impacted to looking at, inmates on Rikers Island fighting to get the education that they believe they deserved and demanding it, to looking at children with disabilities and how it impacts not just them, but their families and the challenges that they have to go through to try to get education. So just really, really deeply well-reported stories, so thank you so much.
I just want to add it was fall 2022, not 2021, so fact-checking myself.
Okay, thank you. I want to stay with you all for a little while longer, and as we think about the stories that you all told, and this question will apply to all of you, but I'll start with the CUNY team first. I'm wondering if you could just share with me some of the challenges. Well, before we go to the challenges, if you can share with me why these stories were so important and the impact of them. I really want to get to sort of the impact aspect of it, beyond the people that you featured in your stories, but sort of what those individuals represent in terms of populations they may represent, but also the issues they represent. If you can just kind of tease that out a little bit more for us, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think, so you're talking about sort of the individual stories and sort of why we sort of chose those. We sort of cast our net wide in the beginning, and these were the stories, so I will say there are plenty of stories that didn't make the cut. And so these are the stories, I think, at the end of the day, we felt like really stood out to us because of what they represented. I mean, you had one story you just mentioned about the student with the disability. You're speaking to a huge population within New York that has trouble access, just getting to school. And we felt like that was a great story to sort of represent that issue. Again, Rikers, just, this was sort of one way into the problem that is Rikers Island. The story that, Safia, you did about, the two schools within the same building. I mean, it's just, that is something that is prevalent across New York. You know, the student about the lack of black male teachers and why they're leaving or not joining. So they were all stories that I think at the end of the day, you know, journalism 101 is what is a character or one story that can speak to a larger issue, and that's the ones that end up becoming the strongest stories. And so those are the ones we gravitated towards. And it was really just, what are the most powerful stories within this theme that we could tell? And it kind of came together nicely, I think, at the end of the day. But we had cast our net wide in the beginning, and it was just, what are the best stories we can tell within this theme of education 3 years into COVID?
Yeah, I think you guys did a wonderful job just sort of weaving that thread through each story, so there was some kind of connective tissue through each one, so really great job. Ramel, I'll ask you the same question in terms of sort of like, you know, the impact of these stories and what they mean and how they represent, you know, a larger population. I mean, you actually looked at a community that is largely Guyanese and other immigrants, and so talk with us a little bit about how, you know, you wanted to show representation and how the impact of these stories helped to do that.
Yeah, I just saw that John is here. I'm not sure if John, if you want to answer the question in terms of, you know, the data and how everything is impacted.
Well, why don't you speak first? I think this is much more a question for the reporting that you did. I'd be happy to add any comments after, but I think Ramel, I'd actually like to hear your response to this question.
Yeah. We do this all the time. No, so similar to what she said, right? Like, we're always trying to find a character that represents something bigger. And what was fascinating about Amit is that it is spoken to three different things that came to mind. One is he was a landlord, and during that time period, landlords were seen as these evil people that were renting the basement apartments to make money. So we wanted to question that and say, okay, yes, he's renting the basement apartment, but there is a reason why people are renting the basement apartment in the first place, is that the housing prices are just way too high in New York City. That was one aspect that we kind of wanted to show, this other side of the equation, right? But two is also the fact that Amit had been in that block for 20 years, and every year since he bought the house, which he didn't know, the block has been flooding. And now FEMA in New York City has this your block may flood, sort of map, where they put all the blocks that are supposed to be flooding. But that block was not there. It was not there until last year, until April of last year, which has consistent when the story came out. But it's kind of hard to track impact, but I like to think that we made impact. But so it took them 24 years to put the block there. And I kept asking myself, I'm like, okay, Amit sort of bought this problem when he bought the house with him. It must have happened before too. And he did. We were able to find the photos that you saw on the screen from 1926, which they had been hidden in the library of the city, city records. And for me, it was like, okay, this is concrete evidence that the city has known, and yet they didn't decide to put this block in the map that it will flood, which in return affected the flood insurance that they couldn't get, and also the FEMA assistance that they couldn't get, tap into. So those kind of things we wanted to show that people are going through this, in many different ways, but that there's also different sides of the story that people should know about.
Yeah, I think it also stood out to me was also like the systemic issue, right? The long-held systemic issues that New York City has faced and have, many would say, ignored for like decades, right? Really like a century. Yeah. And so I think you all did such a wonderful job teasing that out and showing the evidence of, how they have ignored it, right? And now only trying to kind of catch up and fix. And it's almost like, will they ever be able to catch up, right? So now Amit and his family and others have to worry about, when will this happen again? We can mitigate as much as we can, but it's probably going to happen again, and what that's going to mean for their families and their community. John, was there anything more that you wanted to add?
Well, just that these personal stories. So Climate Centrals are kind of an unusual group. We do journalism, but we also do science, meteorology. We have all different types of people working together to research and tell stories about climate change. And our journalism program exclusively collaborates either with local outlets or with outlets that know a certain community. So we do the science and data reporting, and it was great to work with Ramel. He was digging up all this stuff, sending it over. We're doing the reporting that we could do. But around the country, in any climate story, it's always the vulnerable populations that are getting hurt the worst. And it's always the anecdotes and the personal stories that bring these stories to life, both for the local audience, for documented audience in New York City, but also for our more national and even international audience. It's those personal stories that bring it to life. So, just having this amazing insight into the events of the evening when Hurricane Ida hit, but also the context of the relationship between the tenant and the landlord was just so critical and documented, and Romel did such a wonderful job of that. That's really what makes or breaks every story collaboration we do, is the strength of the characters, the strength of the anecdotes. And when you can get in there and tell these personal stories, you really are going to have much more of an impact than if you either just had some anecdotes that are not backed up by a lot of science, or, worse, if you just have stories about rainfall's getting heavier in New York City. It used to be rivers and stuff, so here's the consequences. So I just want to emphasize that, it's that those personal stories that really gave this story so much oomph, and they just did a wonderful job. It was great to work with Documented on this one.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Courtney?
Yeah, so the impact has been heartbreaking and heartwarming on mine. So I'll kind of start with the heartbreaking part of it. I started off the package with this personal story of the Corn Peach family. They're a Ute family that lives out on the Ute Reservation in eastern Utah. And the mom has 3 kids, and we talked about their experiences in the public school system and facing racism within the public school system. And her great-grandparents, if I'm remembering right, it's been a little while since I've written this, had actually been in the boarding school system too, so they were kind of this sadly perfect example of this legacy that had extended from the boarding school system into public school today. And the heartbreaking part of it is, after we published it, we had found all these historical examples too of issues, but the comment section on social media and on the story itself was like, oh, I had the same experience. I'm a Ute student, and I went to high school out on the Uinta Basin out by the reservation, and I had the same experience. And it was just, comment after comment that was just, it affirmed exactly what the story was saying, but it was really hard to see that many Ute students that had gone through the same thing. And the heartwarming part, I guess, is looking forward. The lieutenant governor for our state put out a statement after we published our reporting that said that she promised to look into it and start to correct the issues that had led to this. And it's probably worth pointing out that the Ute students in Utah do fare the worst for any demographic in the state, even compared to other Native American groups, but other Native American groups are also being left behind in their school districts. And so it's a bigger issue that needs to be addressed by the state.
I think what also was a little bit disappointing to me when reading her story is just the responses from the legislatures and local officials, as if like no response or just very vague and no plan set forward to how we're going to try to address this. So that was a little disappointing, but I'm glad that the governor is trying to move things forward. I know from personal experience reporting in Indian country, the issues impacting indigenous communities, how difficult it can be to tell those stories for a number of reasons, right? You've got the cultural issue, the historical, issue. You've got, journalists who are not familiar with the culture coming in and trying to just get their story in and be out. And so, and also just the notion around the challenges that it is to get data, right? From state agencies, from federal government agencies for indigenous communities. I'll pose this question to all of you, but I'll start with you first, Courtney. Can you talk with us about the challenges and the obstacles you faced when you were reporting your story? Perhaps obstacles and challenges that you anticipated you would face and ones that maybe you didn't expect you would face, and how you overcame those. And then I guess sort of the second part of that is how it impacted how you told the story.
I will admit this was the hardest reporting I've done in my life. I think that we did anticipate some of the challenges. The Ute tribe was understandably reticent to talk to us, and I truly say understandably in the biggest sense of that word. I mean, they had no reason to trust me. I'm a white woman going into their reservation, which I asked for permission before going there, to be clear, but going in as an outsider and asking them to tell something that's very challenging, that's challenging today, but has been challenging for decades, and that is a very hurtful history. of assimilation. And I guess the way that we anticipated that, but the way that we got around it was just showing up. I mean, I went out to the reservation, I couldn't even tell you how many times, just spending time there, just trying to make connections, just, sitting down with people and hearing all sorts of issues, like this was the story that we were reporting, but it, isn't the only issue that they care about. And so we reported on the other issues that they brought up during that time. We also made a point to cover both positive and negative things that were happening. So I think so much journalists will kind of helicopter into an area and only tell negative things that are happening there, but that's not the whole story of a people. And so one of the stories that we also did kind of in conjunction with this was this return of this bear dance to one of the towns on the reservation, which is this, really important dance to the Ute tribe. And it was a beautiful chance to get to go witness that dance and to get to tell a positive story and build trust. And one of the families at that dance actually ended up being the lead anecdote to this story. So just building those relationships meant a lot.
Yeah, that's in my experience. It's so key that you have to be there. You have to show that you really care beyond just a story, right? I mean, I remember reporting a documentary with my colleagues when I was at Scripps News, and we were at a reservation in Montana and one in North Dakota, and we literally had to go before the tribal council, like literally sit there and ask for permission. They had to ask us why we were there, why we wanted to report this story, and then we left out and then waited for them to give us permission to come. But you can understand based on some of the things that have happened in the past, stories not being as favorable for them. Ramel, I'll come to you next if you can just talk about some of the challenges that you all face. I mean, particularly because your story has a good number, a notable amount of data, a notable amount of data from the past, like historical data and context, and just knowing how New York City operates, I'm sure there were tons of challenges dealing with local officials there. So talk with us about some of the challenges you guys faced and how you overcame them and sort of the impact it had on the story.
Yeah, so we were trying to get records from many different departments of New York City, and most of the time they told us that they didn't have them, right? And I knew they had them, but we kept pushing throughout a year, and what allowed us to get the data was sort of talking to the homeowners. We went knocking on their doors, talking to all the neighbors, and asked them, hey, do you have any papers that, any documents that can sort of show that they have interacted with you? And what they did eventually is they gave us access to the blueprints. I guess they assumed we weren't going to show up to the record office and go through hundreds of pages of blueprints. But I did, I took the day off, I went there. And it was fascinating because in all the blueprints, you can see how they were elevating the home every time there was a flood. They were trying to prevent, future floods from happening, but you can see it in the architecture. And for me, that was more telling than any other data that I could find. But also the hardest part, when you're using an anecdote, to drive the story is that how can you believe a character just because, they're so invested into it? How can you fact check them, right? So we were working with that character for a year. I was showing up multiple times, even, just to say hi. We were talking to the neighbors. But at the end of the day, some things came up that didn't really make them look in a good light. But as journalists, we have to include it because it is part of our job, right? We found in this story the fact that the basement was in fact deemed illegal by the housing department, and therefore he could be liable for the debts that occur in the basement. As a journalist, I told him hey, I'm going to include this into the article. I know you have a lawsuit going on and this might impact it. But because he trusts me, because I was there often and I was telling him what I was working on, and he saw that I was trying to address the systemic, problem, he's like, include it. And we did include it. We spoke with the lawyers as well, we included there. That was the hardest thing to do because, I knew this person for a year and I still talk to him, But, sort of saying hey, I'm going to include this here that may impact your life. That was very tough to do, but it was, our job and we had to do it.
Yeah, I think what makes something like that even tougher is because in so many respects, the city puts people in that position to have to do that, right? I mean, housing has always been a big issue in New York City, but there's just not enough housing for the people who need it. So then folks who, like your character, who's actually trying to help someone and his family find housing, turns out that it ended up going left for him at the end. CUNY team, I'll turn to you to talk about some of the challenges and obstacles that you all face. I mean, we know how difficult it can be to report on any kind of school system, let alone one of, if not the largest school system in the country. And so I imagine like just getting access to students and getting permission to talk to students and, you know, hearing back from the Department of Education. So talk with us about some of the challenges you all faced.
I think one of the biggest issues, I mean, every story had its own like little quirks that we had to work out, but I think something that we all had to deal with in the editing class as editors, but as well as all of the students from other courses throughout the college that were participating as reporters, was trying to get all of this data and trying to make these stories as strong as possible in 16 weeks, I think. But I mean, their stories are very powerful in that sense. You know, if you give that love and dedication to something that you really care about, for you guys, I think you guys would do it all over again if you could, no matter how long it takes. So I think it was sort of a blessing in disguise. A lot of the students that participated in this project sort of did go ahead and, you know, investigate their stories a little bit more or ask more questions. But if you guys want to add more to some of our issues, I think it was just like a lot of very little things for all of them, but I think that was the biggest issue for the project as a whole.
Awesome.
Yeah. I was gonna put you on the spotlight. You were talking about standing outside the school, having to, how difficult it is.
So I spent a lot of time loitering outside schools for this one. And, you know, parents are very busy, so I pick up when they're like leaving and I'm like, hey, can I talk to you? They're like, yeah, but you have to walk with me. So I ended up like walking back and forth in that area for a long time. But what comes to mind when I think about the most challenging aspect of this piece is just that, much like Courtney's, it's such an old problem. And so there's a lot of the narratives around this issue feel like very solidified. And so it was a challenge that I wanted to kind of bring a new understanding of this very old problem, where I think that my reporting showed me that there were a lot of misunderstandings about the issue, and namely that, you know, going into this, the predominant narrative really felt like, you know, these white, wealthy schools were aspirational for Black and brown students, but for whatever reason, they couldn't get students in those schools. And I think what I tried to do with my reporting was show that the barriers are a lot more complicated, and actually there's a lot of ways that these whiter, wealthier schools were not meeting the needs of Black and brown students. And so I think the breakthrough on this piece came, you know, not necessarily from like access issues, but more so from like deeply listening and trying to get past the kind of prevailing narratives that, you know, informed my understanding prior to starting the project.
And I'll just add one sort of overarching thought. I mean, you talked about it, like getting in touch with the DOE teachers. It's so difficult. And I think one big lesson that I hope, you know, students took away from this is just thinking creatively when you can't get access. Like, just because a press secretary is not calling you back, like there's so many, just because a teacher won't call you back, there's so many other ways to get to sources. And oftentimes the story's stronger because you found another way in that you weren't thinking of doing. So I hope, you know, you all came away kind of like, okay, like this person won't pick up my phone call, I have to go knock on their door, or I have to go, you know, meet them somewhere kind of unconventional to get the story.
Yeah, what we used to call shoe leather reporting, right? Hitting the streets and getting out there. So we're gonna be wrapping up our time with the panelists. I'm gonna ask them one other question, but I wanna turn it over to the audience after I do. So I'm giving you a little bit of time to think about what questions you're gonna wanna ask of the panelists. My last question is, I wanted to just talk a little bit about each of you have a very nuanced and in-depth stories that include characters, right? Like very strong, memorable characters. And last evening we had a Pulitzer podcast launch, and one of the Pulitzer winners, Mr. John Archibald, talked about he said something to the effect of having people share their stories with us as journalists is a gift. Right? And that really resonated with me because I think it's so true and so important. So I wanted to just have you all talk about, you know, you have these wonderful characters in your stories, and a lot of them are character driven, but yet you also have great use of data, great use of historical and present-day context, and it's all very balanced. So talk with me a little bit about how you go about gathering information, your process, storyboarding, story outlining, contacting sources, which you've hit on a little bit already, your writing process. So just very briefly, because then we'll open it up to our audience. And I'll start with you first, Ramel, if you don't mind.
Before we sort of focus on the MID, we had spoken with 26 different homeowners who were afflicted by floods. And throughout their stories, we sort of saw something in common. And all of them kept mentioning, like, hey, you got to talk to Amit. So we went, knocked on his door one day, and he wasn't there. So we went back the next day. But the thing is, the videos and the sort of historical data was mostly used to fact-check his story because it was so unbelievable. Something that when I heard it, I'm like, this is very traumatic. And, I'm sorry you have to tell me again because I have to write this down. But I also need to be able to check this. So we were using the videos that we included as a way to check the time frames of when everything was happening for us to develop the story, right? But then we also realized that sometimes, a picture speaks, 1,000 words. And we included like 3 GIFs or GIFs, as some people call it, just because you can see, this is a home, and all of us have homes, and we wouldn't like that. We wouldn't like to, for our home to be flooded every other year. So the data was to expand it to say like, hey, this is happening at his house, but in the future it's gonna happen to other houses too, which is, and I'll pass it on to John because I think he's gonna talk about the data of the rainfall.
John, do you want to weigh
Sure.
in here?
Sure. What I would say is that in terms of challenges with data, when it comes to covering how climate change and environmental change is affecting flood risks at coastlines, so storm surges, nuisance flooding, not too hard. Like there's a lot of data around sea level rise. There's lots of data out there. When it comes to what we're seeing is much worse inland flooding from farms in Kansas to homes in Maine. We're seeing a lot more inland flooding. And even though Hurricane Sandy was a coastal flood, Hurricane Ida, this is just from the rainfall, it's very difficult to figure out what is causing the flooding to get worse inland, such as the case for Ida. We know rainfall's getting heavier, but there's urbanization, there's things that are happening to streams and so forth. And really what was critical for this story, and something we've tried to replicate in other cities, but it's a lot harder when you're not dealing with something like New York City and its density, was the fact that documents had found out that there was these data sources that we could overlay on one another. There was 2 data sources. There was where are the most calls coming for flooding, and also where are the most violations for illegal basement dwellings occurring. And so by overlaying those, we kind of were able to work with Documenta to generate a heat map that showed us where the problem was concentrated. By talking to experts, we could establish the fact that it's not just heavy rainfall, it's the fact that there's some real urban design problems there in New York City that can be fixed, that should have been fixed, that haven't been fixed. And so by working with this unique data set that Documenta was able to dig up, we were able to go a lot further than we've been able to go in other cities when it comes to inland flooding and what's causing that inland flooding. And of course, it's climate change, but there's other issues, and you never want to just blame climate change because that's letting local officials and decision makers off the hook, for things that they could be doing. So yeah, this was a really challenging story, and it took a really long time in terms of all the wonderful work that Ramel and his colleagues did, but also in terms of just understanding how can we figure out why is the flooding getting worse and where is it getting worse. So that's how we kind of solved it with documented assistance.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Courtney, I'll turn to you if you want to talk just briefly about sort of some of the ways you all went about telling the story and reporting it.
I love that description of sources being a gift.
Yeah.
It's truly, I'm so grateful, and that doesn't even capture it to all the folks that talked to me for this story. Like I said, it's a lot of trauma. I mean, the lead anecdote is, a student and his mom recalling him being called stupid by his teacher, and it's, they've carried that, and it's painful, and I'm asking them to relive that trauma to me so that we can use it to talk about the bigger problem and hopefully bring about some change. But just immensely grateful to the people that took the time to talk to me. and the tribe that welcomed me onto their land, you know, they're a sovereign nation and they didn't have to do that. As far as data goes, you don't even want to see the beginning spreadsheet. I looked through so much testing data, so many years, and it's all broken down. So, I mean, there's like 3rd grade reading, 3rd grade math, 3rd grade science, and it's an immense amount, and it was a lot of math behind it, and journalists are notoriously not great at math, but, you know, we make it work, and, yeah, the story process, sometimes I think it's like a woman having a baby and she thinks it's not that bad, and then she has another baby and she's like, oh my gosh, it was that bad. I forgot how bad it was, and the story was hard, but you know, it was worth it, and we'll probably do it again and forget how bad it was.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you all sticking with it. It's such an important story. My CUNY team here, why don't you just talk a little briefly about sort of your process? Was there a lot of brainstorming or storyboarding, and how you all kind of put these stories together?
Yeah, it was a lot of discussion with our faculty, ourselves in that editing class, but also all of the students that wanted to join in on the product as well. It was just, I think we just got really lucky that semester that we had very curious minds in the classroom at all times. So there was always more questions or, you know, ideas of like different angles or perspectives that we can take on the systemic issue. So a lot of chats, not just in the classroom, on Slack, email, phone calls, FaceTimes, like anything you can think of in and outside of the classroom. That's basically what we did. And then you would write on the board a lot, and it would get really messy by the end of the period. We also had like a master doc that also got really messy at one point, so we had to redo it. But yeah, a lot of note taking, just tons.
A lot of coordinating. A lot of coordinating.
I'm sure. Full court press, I'm sure. Well, we'll go ahead and open up to the audience now. If you have questions that you would love to ask our esteemed panelists, please come up to the mic. They'll be happy to answer.
Thank you so much. A great series of stories. Courtney, it strikes me specifically to you, is there a sequel? I mean, there's got to be, and then to the rest of the panel, but in particular, it seems like you really had such a connection in the story with the people you were dealing with. So what's the sequel?
That is a great question. I don't want to scoop myself too much. We did do a short follow-up on the Lieutenant Governor's promise to step in and do something, and she hasn't actually stepped in and done anything yet, so we're kind of holding her feet to the fire a little bit with that. But we do want to explore higher education. So the University of Utah, which is the flagship school in the state, has a memorandum with the Ute tribe that it promises, you know, in exchange for using the Utes as its mascot, that it will educate students in exchange. And the early indications are that it has not lived up to that promise. And so that means that K through 12 is failing Ute students and higher education is failing Ute students. So there is a lot there, though. There is a lot there.
So my question's also for Courtney. So I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, and that's a big, you wouldn't guess it, but it's a huge Mormon population, and we're very close to Utah. And I guess my question is regarding your story, because I mean, Utah's, what, 90% white population, I believe, their demographic is, which is a huge difference from Nevada, which is like a solid, I think, 20% difference, which in Nevada it's like about 70. But I guess kind of my question is like, regarding the Utes, I'm trying to think of a way to word this properly, and I guess in a way it's felt like discrimination in a way. How did kind of the religious population in Utah play a part in that further discrimination, because you didn't see it anywhere else except for in Utah? I mean, with such a huge disparity, I guess what I'm trying to say.
Just a really good question, and I probably don't have a perfect answer for you. You're right, Utah is hugely white, and that does affect a lot of it. I think why we were so interested in this story is that Utah is largely white, but it uses a tribal name. Utah is named for the Utes, and it's neglecting the very children that the state is named after. The LDS Church does have kind of a bad history, if I can say that, with Native populations. I mean, there's this, I mean, a lot of, westward movement has that history, but the Mormon Church in particular had the Indian Student Placement Program, which is, again, something that we want to look into in the future. There is a lot there to report on, but it did play into that. You're right.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
Hi. So each of you has tackled a truly intractable problem, right, with institutions that have just let these problems go on forever. And just by doing that, you have brought attention to them and brought light to them. But I always wonder, then what? You have the governor, but, are these institutions is there going to be change? And can you, are you interested in following that?
Well, I mean, I think, with the issue of education, and let me rephrase that. I think you bring up an interesting point, which is oftentimes as journalists, we like to report what's going wrong, and we kind of forget to follow up and report on what's going right. Not that there's always something going right, but I think it's important to not only follow up on these stories and hold officials' feet to the fire, but also be there when things change and when things get better. And let's say, Rikers Island's education system all of a sudden gets better, which it won't, but let's say it does, we should be there to report that out, because part of the reporting of wrongs, I think it's our responsibility to understand what that does to a reader and what that does to a voter, an American. We live in such a polarized world right now, and people read bad news and they read about their beloved institutions and people they've looked up to for years all of a sudden doing bad things, and nothing seems to be going right for the things that they thought were supposed to be going right. I think it's our responsibility to understand our role in that and not only follow up with coverage that holds people accountable, but follow up with coverage that reports when good things happen and when things do get fixed, and then continue to hold people accountable past that as well. So, with New York City education, I mean, it's such an intractable issue, like you said, so much more reporting to be done there, but also a lot that is happening that deserves to be reported.
Well, I would say that I think your stories also did highlight some of the incredible things that folks are doing to kind of help mitigate and to address some of the holes and problems that they had, that they were seeing. So, hats off to you all for showing the problem, but also highlighting some of the people who are looking to actively work to address those. So I think that's our time for our panel. I want to thank everyone, thank our panelists for coming and sharing more information about your stories. It's a great conversation, and thank you all so much for your questions from the audience.
So let's hear it one more time for this year's Shaufler Prize winners, and congratulations to you all. And thank you again for all the important work that you do. I also want to thank our judges and tonight's moderator, Professor Hill. I would like to also once again express my personal appreciation to Paul and his family for their generosity and trust in the Cronkite School to administer this meaningful program. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Aspen. Thank you very much. And that concludes tonight's program.